right. Oh, thanks for the intro. It's always nicer to have someone else talk about me than me talk about myself. So my name is David. I work for a company called Wix, and I'm going to talk to you today about both the ecosystem that we have, how we built it, and the things you want to take into consideration if you are going to build an ecosystem. So about Wix, who are we? We are the largest cloud-based web development platform. We are an HTML5 site builder. Basically, if you can use PowerPoint, you can use our platform. We have hundreds of designer-made templates. We have an app market and an SDK, which is what I work on. And we target primarily small businesses, photographers, artists, e-commerce, anyone who really cares about design really finds a nice home at Wix. So in terms of numbers, just real quick, we have about 53 million users. Actually, that's sites, about 54 million. If you were to go to our site, it probably says 54 now. We get about 45,000 new users a day. But for the pieces that I'm going to talk about, which are interesting, we get about 34,000 app installs per day. And of that, each application gets about 150 installs per day. If you compare this with iOS or Android, where unless you're Flappy Bird and for some reason everybody loves you, you're really not going to get a lot of publicity. You're not going to get a lot of downloads. And of that, for the the nerds in the room, which is hopefully everybody, we get about 70 million HTTP requests per day. Huge, huge, huge numbers. So what's a Wix app? So we talked about we have this very nice cloud-based editor. But what's the app? So the app is composed of a couple pieces. The major piece are iframes that are embedded within either the site that a site viewer sees or the site that the site owner sees, either through a configuration dialog, through settings in the editor itself. And the other piece is an external application server. You host the application, we serve your iframes. The distribution is installation from our app market. Our app market is available embedded directly inside of the editor product, inside of the site management, what we call the My Account area, and directly on Wix.com. We support a freemium model, and we build directly through Wix with a rev share model. If you're familiar with rev share on iOS or Android, very, very, very similar. We have a number of account managers that actually handle the app review process. And we are not just a walled garden, but we are a boutique walled garden. When I say boutique, I mean that we curate each and every app that goes into our store. Not only do we do that, but we provide direct product help for all of these applications. We want to make sure that each application that goes in is easy to use, is beautiful, has a nice product flow. We really want to make sure that the experience that we put so much work into in our editor product goes into each app that goes into our ecosystem. In terms of the SDK, it's composed of a number of different pieces. We have our JavaScript libraries. Our JavaScript libraries compose both UI libraries, so you can make your application look and feel like a Wix app. They also include runtime and design time libraries, so that both when you're embedded within our editor or when you're actually running within a live Wix site, you can integrate nicely with our product. We have a number of REST APIs that integrate with the back office components of our applications. Each Wix site is also a mini CRM that tracks information about the contacts that you are interacting with on a daily basis and the activities that they're actually performing on your site. Since so many of our customers are small businesses, this kind of CRM information is incredibly valuable to them, and we expose it all through REST APIs. We have webhooks that call back to your application to inform you of lifecycle events. And we have a number of client libraries for the REST APIs. In addition to this, we also have a support organization. It composes of, like I said earlier, account managers, people who do direct support to higher-end clients. It contains documentation, dev centers, dev relations teams, the things you would think of when you're trying to get people to buy off on your platform. So all of this started from one method. Our entire SDK started from one method over 2 years ago. If you want to think about where the landscape was, I think it's important to take stock in what we had and where we were then. Node.js didn't really have a lot of traction. Angular, not so much. React was pretty much unheard of. Things like Parse or Firebase didn't really exist yet. HTML5 was still in its infancy. We were actually one of the first web platforms to fully adopt HTML5. We switched over from Flash to HTML5, in fact. And the landscape looked incredibly different. You didn't have to argue about grunt versus gulp. There's really only the question of what is this thing called grunt and should I use it? The landscape was very, very, very different. And we knew at that time that we had a lot of traction and we had a lot of users, about 30, 35 million at that point. And we wanted to start embedding applications within the ecosystem. We thought it would be an amazing distribution channel. And we really wanted to take advantage of it. And there's only so much that we can provide to our customers. We have our very specific paths. We have the very specific features that we want to give to people. But outside of that, we can't predict everything. And we thought that if we could create a flourishing ecosystem around applications, we'd really improve the experience for our users. Because at the end of the day, Wix is about making sure that our users are happy, that their businesses flourish, and they have amazing sites. So our reality at the time was that we wanted something that would easily integrate within Wix. And we wanted to follow what we call the 5-minute rule, that basically you could get up and running in about 5 minutes. The very first application that we thought about building was a blog, just something simple. And when you think about a blog, what do you need? You need pages. You need the ability to potentially navigate between the pages. And you need something as simple as just expanding the window that you have to include more content. So those were our goals. And they're pretty simple goals. It was really not very ambitious, but we thought we'd start with something very small. This was our MVP, right? Something very small, and if it took off, we'd add and start iterating on the product. We faced a number of unique challenges, though. So Wix used a custom JavaScript renderer. Again, if you think back 2.5 years ago, you didn't have flexboxes, you didn't have fancier layout techniques in HTML5, right? You basically had what the browser was capable of doing. And if you think about how far the browsers have come in 2 years, it's really mind-blowing. So when we were designing our HTML5 editor product, having moved away from Flash, we had to have something that would be pixel perfect, as Flash was. And in order to be pixel perfect, we needed to have an editor product that could actually support this, but in the HTML5 context. And so we did it, and it worked very successfully. However, when you're thinking about building an SDK around this, building an API around this, you really have to weigh this decision of, do I want to force a new framework onto all of these existing developers, right? If we're going to try to work with the 5-minute rule, is this actually going to work? Am I actually going to be able to teach somebody a brand new JavaScript framework that includes how we handle rendering, how we handle event delegation, our component model, and still think that people are going to buy into this platform? We didn't think that we had the ability or the sway to do that at the time. Another piece that we had that is very challenging is that WYSIWYG editors are fragile. If you're building a platform and you're building something that allows for PowerPoint-like functionality, you can't really provide a lot of rope. There's the expression that if you don't want to provide so much rope that you hang yourself. And this was our case. If for whatever reason an external application that we embedded were to go down, were to break, the entire editor product would fail, and our users, who are not very technical, would call us and say, hey, something broke. And it would provide a terrible experience for our end users. Another challenge is we had no idea who our customers would be. We could assume. We thought, okay, we're probably going to get existing applications, people who want to embed within our platform. We had our eyes on partners like Shopify, who we ended up partnering with, who have an app in our app market. But we didn't really know. We didn't have a good idea. There wasn't anything we could perform a user study about. So we kind of had to guess. And of course, like everything else, we had few resources for the project. We gathered a couple core people, 5, 8 people altogether, and tried to build something. And what we came up with is interesting. It worked at the time, and it still works today. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is about pragmatism, is about taking something that might seem a little bit unseemly but actually fits the bill perfectly given the technology stack of the time. So the very first method we rolled out with was Wix report height change, and this is all JavaScript. A little star there shows that it's deprecated, both because the naming is terrible and we wanted to kind of reorganize our namespaces. But this was the first method that launched our SDK. We came up with a way of embedding applications directly within the Wix editor product, and this was integrated through iframes. And whenever I say iframes, it always kind of rolls off my tongue badly, because it's unseemly. It's not something that when you're thinking about how you're going to architect something, the last thing I think of is iframes. But we're going to get into why this was actually, for the time and even for today, a very pragmatic and very good decision for us. We decided that the very best way of actually communicating would be over post message. This is something that we could take advantage of in HTML5 or use polyfills for the browsers that didn't support what we wanted to do. And we could essentially send messages back and forth across the gap between our iframes. We decided not to build a JavaScript framework. We decided not to take our framework and expose it or buy into any other framework that happened to exist at the time. Again, when we're thinking about how we're going to get people into our platform, the thought of forcing them onto Backbone, Ember, even something as simple as jQuery, was more than we had the stomach for. And we wanted to give choice, which, funny enough, was very successful, but also came back to bite us in really funny ways. We also decided to have a language-agnostic backend. Like I said earlier, each application is served through your own server, and it has to support multi-tenancy, meaning that anytime you're installed into a site, we give you a unique identifier for that site, and that's basically your foreign key into any data that you might have. We decided that given the partners that we were trying to embed, the larger guys wouldn't want to host with us. The smaller guys, they might want to, but we weren't comfortable, again, creating a PaaS, platform as a service. There wasn't a clear language winner at the time. There wasn't anything that had the momentum of, say, Node.js right now. People were still talking about Java, Ruby. Scala wasn't really big yet. It's funny, I talk about 2 years ago like it was so long ago, but in the technology sense, it really was. And that's what we rolled out with. So I want to talk about why we chose iframes. Because again, it's something that we grappled with a lot, and we still do because it's not a perfect model. And as we look at how we're growing our platform and how we're advancing what we do, we are reevaluating this decision all the time. When you think about an iframe is a sandbox. An iframe basically says that whatever is inside of this content is not accessible to anybody else. Not only that, I cannot get my enclosing context. I cannot get my parent. I can't inspect the DOM. I can't inject anything. I can only do so much badness, right? And when you look at what the other solutions were, web components were not standard. They're still not standard today, but they were even less supported than they are right now. If you look at something like Polymer, which Google just released a really nice UI toolkit for at their last Google I/O conference. Polymer is beautiful. It does really nice stuff. It really takes web components and Shadow DOM to the next level. But even its sandbox model is not amazing. It still doesn't provide us the amount of security we need to ensure that both the WYSIWYG editor doesn't break and that one bad application does not bring down the entire site. Because really, when you think about this, for us, that is the absolute worst thing that could happen. If you're building a site on top of our platform, you care that your site is always available, always has a great experience, because it's not just your site, it's not just your product, it's not your phone that you're interacting with. And if the application crashes, sure. This is your business, right? You are trusting in us to actually serve the visible part of your business. It can't go down. It absolutely can't. One bad application cannot break what you've built. We'd look terrible. And so, iframes. And even today, there is yet to be a technology that supports all of these use cases in a way that we could use them. And unfortunately, this is pragmatic. This isn't taking the best and shiniest piece of technology that exists today. This is taking something that, for our unique needs, we need to support. And we used JavaScript as a bridge, right? This did a lot of great things for us. It basically avoided, like I've been talking about before, avoided forcing a new JavaScript framework on anybody. It also avoided us having to take our JavaScript framework public. The documentation challenge there, the resourcing, the documentation, all of these things would have just been a huge burden. And when we're just trying to release something quick and dirty, not dirty, but something quick, it wasn't something that we could do. And the small API is something that we could very easily consider people to learn. When we looked at how we actually implemented it, this was all methods as commands. Basically use the command pattern. So we would send a JSON packet back and forth over the wire using post message. And these commands can cross iframe boundaries, and they're controlled by us. Make sure that we know everything that is being sent back and forth. And what's interesting here is that, of course, because it's post message, everything needs to be asynchronous. We use callbacks, not promises. And today we argue internally whether we should actually move to promises. And out of curiosity, how many people in here, when you're authoring JavaScript, use promises? Right, so it's how many in here consider using promises or know about promises? Right, so it's still, about 20% of the audience that's actually using promises, and this is a Future of the Web Apps conference, and about 50% that's interested. For our user base runs the gamut from jQuery engineers to people who are building giant full-stack applications. And whenever you have to think about taking new technology, no matter how cool and shiny it is, you need to think about the user base that you're actually targeting. And if I were to give you guys the API documentation, the 25% who are using promises today would say, okay, great. The rest of you would have to then go learn about promises in order to actually start engaging with our APIs. It's a learning curve. And when we still didn't have an app market, we didn't really know about our distribution channel, it wasn't something we felt confident that we could hoist onto our hopeful developer community. The other piece that we came out with was developer relations. We had to. It's something that if you're going to build an ecosystem around an API, you need developer relations. Evangelists, documentation, support, etc. So what we decided to do, because we were small at the time, was to get large partners involved by providing personal support. We went after them, think a consulting model. We went after them, we sat with them, we flew to them. We gave them direct targeted support, and we used them as our first customers and also did a lot of validation against them. For individual developers, for the small indie guys who came through more organic traffic, we would provide online resources. In the real world, that meant hackathons, conferences. We have a lounge now in San Francisco for developers. We also have a New York City lounge that hosts basically everybody. If you're ever in New York and you need a nice place to use Wi-Fi, 23rd and 7th. It's amazing and free. So as we move forward, so this was all about 2 years ago. So as we move forward, we had to really get serious about how we grow our SDK. And this means a couple very important things. We use personas for targeting specific users. Are you guys familiar with personas? It's something that comes from the UX world, but when you're talking about developer experience, or DX, the same kind of persona targeting is exceptionally useful. Think about, you break your users off into segments and stories of this person is using jQuery, they're an indie developer, they have a friend who's providing their backend support. This person works for a large corporation and is using Angular or React on the front end. It really helps you target the APIs and think about all the cases. And for us, we have a couple of core personas. And we make sure that for each API that we roll out, we make sure that it fits the persona. And with personas also go into use cases. And these use cases basically model the flows and sanity test any ideas. We need to basically say that if we want to accomplish X, what does that mean? What does the API look like? Is it confusing? Is it too verbose? Is it going to be too much for someone to actually quickly and easily learn? For a lot of these, we want to make sure that someone can look at the API and without reading too far into the documentation, can get a good sense of what it actually means. We do constant competitive analysis, and we do customer visits to test the effectiveness of the APIs. Whenever we fly to partners, whenever we have hackathons, whenever we do any of these things, we talk directly to our customers and ask them the hard questions that we might not want to hear the answers to. Does it work for you? Does it make sense? Do you like using it? All these things that, if you have an ego about this, will upset you. But you have to set that aside because the experience that your developers have is more important than how you feel, than how invested you are in what you've built. We also dog food our SDK internally. We have a number of applications, 2 of them that were just released, that actually use the SDK. And it's become our core integration channel within the company. We adhere to standards whenever possible. We have to. We want to make sure that anything we're using exists already, and we try to never reinvent the wheel. We also add, as we talk to users, any tools, anything that might actually be useful to get our developers onboarded and moving forward. Here's a simple example, REST APIs. It's a standard REST API. What does that mean? Standard verbs, none of this everything as a get, get customer, delete customer, etc. as get. Actually using real verbs, including patch, to actually get off the ground. Real response codes, 200 means 200, 400 means 400. We're not reinventing anything here. Semantic versioning, so that when you're actually using the API, you know which version you're targeting against. And we do 2 levels to make sure that you specify both the API family and the specific version number to make sure that we don't break your application. It sounds a little like overboard for versioning, but it ensures that no one is ever broken. A lot of people may not update their application. Once it's in the market, it's kind of fire and forget. You want to make sure that if they forget, unless we're going to notify them specifically, everything is going to keep running. Consistency across all APIs. Paging for data. Everything that returns a set is paging. The naming is the same. The patterns are the same. These are things that sound really simple, that are really obvious. And a lot of API design is common sense, right? You put yourself into the mind of the user. You expect that it's going to be named like this, that it's going to work like this. But the second you deviate from the path just a little bit, you're going to hang yourself. You're going to create an API that's unusable, that doesn't make any sense, and no one is actually going to want to use. We also use Swagger for interactive documentation. It's an amazing tool. It's the best tool we've found to document REST APIs. And we use REST in place of RPC internally. So, postmortem. If I'm going to be honest about what we did a number of things right. Our APIs are exceptionally easy. Exceptionally easy. We have very few complaints from customers that our APIs are difficult. Self-hosting means that app integrations for large companies are very easy. When we integrated with, I keep using Shopify, but I'll use their competitor Equid as an example, 2 giant e-commerce players. It was very easy for them. They had an existing product. It was as simple as creating a new endpoint on their server, wrapping something with the correct JavaScript APIs, and embedding it directly. It was nearly painless. Our direct product support means that we get amazing apps. When you're a boutique garden and you're willing to provide product managers, from us to these applications, the applications end up looking and feeling amazing, and they feel nearly like native applications. And we successfully use it internally. So that's what we did right. And the things that we did less right or just completely wrong in these cases. We use HMAC signing instead of OAuth, which is again us deviating from a known standard. And it's a constant headache for us. Whenever we sign an API request, it has to go through a very specific algorithm. We've provided tools, we've provided client libraries, and still it's one of the largest sources of confusion because it's not something you can just go look up on Stack Overflow. Our documentation is lackluster or terrible, but we provide direct support, so it's a balancing act. Our example code needs to be much better. And something I talked about earlier, by being agnostic, it gives a lot of freedom, but you end up with paralysis of choice. For new or small indie developers, they don't know what technology stack to use, both back-end and front-end. And also multi-tenancy, the idea that your application, one application through different IDs, is presenting different data to each user, is actually a large burden for independent developers. Databases, security, dealing with foreign keys, it's unfortunately a lot of work. So what I want to talk about now is just the things that, when I look at building an SDK, are the single most important things to take into consideration as you're moving forward. You have to know your audience. You have to. This is the single most important thing. You have to know who you're targeting. You have to create personas for them. And you really have to know what kind of stories you want them to successfully succeed in, right? You have to target users specifically. And you have to segment your APIs across skill levels. There's nothing wrong with creating very advanced APIs. Something we've talked about on the promises versus callbacks side is basically if you don't provide the callback and have the callback as the last piece of as one of the last arguments of returning a promise, or always returning a promise. Things like this that you can buy in either way, and we can target the documentation accordingly. As you know your audience, you also need to plan your support collateral as you're building your SDK. You don't want to build the SDK and then talk about documentation later. When today's documentation is so good, Angular notwithstanding, you look at React's documentation, it's amazing. Parse's documentation is wonderful. Even Apple does an amazing job. You see, there's great documentation, and you expect this now. As developers, the days of just reading JavaScript source code and trying to figure out what's going on are basically ending, thank God. We're moving into a world where you have amazing, amazing documentation and amazing support and amazing examples. And if you're going to be a player on the API space, you need to do the exact same things. And you also have to be aware of fads. I cannot stress this enough. Are you guys familiar with To Do MVC, the site? There's 40 MVC frameworks. There's how many AMD libraries out there? There's Grunt, there's Gulp, there's Broccoli, there's all of these different tools, right? 2 years from now, what are we going to talk about as things that people are still using? I can guess, you can guess. And unless this framework, unless this library is something that you own and you use internally and you're willing to put forward, think very carefully before you hoist this onto your developer community. It's cool, it's shiny, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be right for your community. Don't make developers hate you. It sounds very simple, but easy things like minimizing your organizational knowledge, things that you know internally that you then have to explain externally, always get complicated. It's like telephone. You always lose something as it goes from person to person to person. You need to make sure that you hide as much of the internal noise as possible and provide a very nice facade into the complication that is your organization. And that also means doing the hard work for your users. If you're providing an API, we are providing a service. We're providing magic. We're providing something very difficult that other people want to consume, and you don't want to make the burden exceptionally high. You also want to use known concepts. Don't reinvent anything. Don't reinvent the wheel. We stand at this beautiful time where there's so much hard work that has come before us that we can just steal. Part of my job as an architect is basically stealing other people's ideas, retargeting them a little bit, and then releasing them back. Unless you come up with something that is so much better than everyone else's, and everyone else is going to copy you, don't reinvent it just because you can. Think very carefully about that. And you also want to stay consistent. Your APIs should look and feel the same. And also, as we talked about with the iframe example, pragmatism can lower learning curves. By not taking that custom JavaScript framework you have and exposing it, by using iframes instead of doing something that could be a little bit more elegant, you're going to pragmatically lower the difficulty of getting people involved in your platform. And also, you want to provide top-notch support. I cannot stress this enough. You have to build clear documentation. You have to provide sample code, real-world examples, support engineers or engineers who can support. If you throw a hackathon, if you have an example online, someone should be able to pull from a Git repository, go into the command line, do 2 things, and get started. If you've seen Firebase's 5-minute Get Started tutorial, it's fantastic. You have a fully running application in literally 5 minutes. It doesn't get much better than that. And as all of you also are thinking about shopping around and moving to different platforms, this is something that is key to that decision. Is it easy? Can I get involved? These are things that you have to do as you're moving forward. So that about wraps it up with about 30 seconds to spare. So I'd like to thank you all for listening. One last bit, we are actually sponsoring a London hackathon. The important bit here is that you can win a free trip to San Francisco. We'll have a lot more information about it outside at one of our booths. And if you guys have any questions about anything I talked about, since I think I ran over for Q&A, we'll be sitting outside, and don't hesitate to come chat me up. Thanks, guys.